Okay, I think we'll get started. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this plenary panel on the EU's global role, capacities, credibility, and coherence. My name's Jeremy Cliff. I'm the Berlin Bureau Chief of The Economist, and I'm very pleased to be joined by an excellent panel to discuss this subject over the next 45 minutes or so. To my left is Josef, who's a senior fellow and head of the Berlin office at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He was previously at the Bertelsmann Stiftung and has written a lot on not just German foreign policy, but very much how it fits into a wider European framework. So I'm very pleased to be getting his thoughts on that here today. To my right is Elena Korosteleva, which I think I pronounced just about right, who's Professor of International Politics, Jean Monnet Chair of European Politics, and Director at the Global Europe Centre at the University of Kent. She is a particular expert on Europe's relationship with countries to its east, and also is particularly interested in the subject of resilience as an organising idea for European foreign policy. So I look forward to her views on that, among other things. And last but not least, Petr Drulák is the Czech Republic's ambassador to France. He's been in that role since February 2017 and previously was the political secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and before that, First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. He's also a professor of political science at the Charles University here in Prague. So a very warm welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us. We're going to have a bit of a discussion up here on the panel, first of all, about this subject, but then I'd like to open it up to the floor fairly promptly, and you can submit your questions via Slido, sli.do. I believe the code for the conference is being shown on the screens, or will be shown on the screens shortly, so please do submit your questions, and we'll come to those fairly soon. I'd like to start by throwing open a premise to the panelists here, which is not necessarily my view about this subject, but it's one that I hope will provoke some interesting responses. So a pessimist looking at Europe today would say that there is an enormous divide between optimistic rhetoric about Europe's global role and Josef and I sit in Berlin. We're hearing a lot of nice words about Europe taking over more responsibility at the moment. Angela Merkel, in her speech in Aachen at the Charlemagne Prize a few weeks ago, was saying Europe can't rely on the United States to protect it any longer. It needs to take its fate into its own hands. Heiko Maas, the German foreign minister, gave a speech recently saying that Europe united needs to be the response to America first. So a lot of nice words. And then you look at the reality and you see perhaps a Europe that is struggling to respond to the Trump administration's unilateralism, either because it's divided, for example, on tariffs, or because it's simply ineffective, for example, with the Iran deal. You could be pessimistic, too, about the piecemeal nature and tortoise pace of European Defence Cooperation. The new European Defence Headquarters has been compared to a call centre, so understaffed and modest is its reach. And then one looks at the European neighbourhood, a big subject, particularly here in the Czech Republic, where the lofty idealism of the European neighbourhood policy has given way to chaos on Europe's fringes and struggles at Europe's heart to respond to that chaos. So looking at all of that, and from this rather pessimistic and gloomy point of view, I'm tempted to ask, is Europe a geopolitical dwarf? Do you recognise that gloomy diagnosis of the situation, and if not, why not? And so I might start, if it's all right with you, Josef? So I just have a few thoughts from each of the panelists, and then we'll go to a discussion.
Well, thanks very much, Jeremy. I think what you described at the outset, the rhetoric that we were both exposed to in Berlin, in probably in English you would use the term is whistling in the dark. You know, we're encouraging ourselves to be brave in a situation which is very discouraging. Particularly when people like Angela Merkel look at the world, they see actually that the world has changed in a way that size or weight matters much more than it used to. You know, and that, I think, then gets to your analogy of the political dwarf. In the way that the Europeans have imagined an effective multilateralism, whether you're a dwarf or a giant would not have mattered that much. But in a way in which international relations, in the words of the US president, is essentially cooperation and conflict between sovereign nations. Size matters greatly. And then we recognize that even though arithmetically Europe is a political giant. We are a political dwarf because we are Europe. And being Europe means that we have this vast potential in economics, in finance, but also in military, on paper, if we would just add it up altogether. But being Europe means 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. We can't add up just our capabilities because we're lacking a unitary political structure to effectively operationalize or leverage the potential that we have. And in the absence of that, we have to do with allies. And one of these allies is our declaration machinery, which is called CFSP. Another one is this informal directorate of the few large that we see in the Normandy format. It has effect, it produces outcome, but it is certainly not the giant that we probably would need to be to secure our interests in this rather exposed and vulnerable position that Europe finds itself in the world.
Thank you very much. Elena, your thoughts, please.
Thank you. I would rather disagree than with my previous panelist, simply in order to provoke yet again some reaction from the audience. I don't think this world is actually where the size still matters, and in fact matters even more these days, and I don't think we should be talking about giants or dwarfs anymore. Yes, I know that perhaps the situation is a bit discouraging at the moment, but yet again there are opportunities there, and that's what I wanted to say. It is about change and how we actually understand change these days. You see, there was a very interesting document issued by External Action Service, pre-strategy document in 2015, which talked about this 3C world, which is about the world that is becoming more complex, more connected, and more contested. Of course, the world is becoming more complex in the sense that there are a lot of unknowns, but not just unknowns, but also us not having the knowledge how to deal with these unknowns. The world is far more connected, therefore we need to be kind of aware about what is happening around us. And the world is more contested in the sense that, the international liberal order is shrinking, but it is still there. But we also need to be aware how the world is now going to organize itself. And that is a very crucial point about change. And that is the reason why I'm saying that there are no more giants, or will be no more giants, and there are no dwarfs, simply because we are no longer in the world, or in the situation, at least we are moving away from it, of multipolarity. There are no more poles per se that would continue defining the politics of the world. And we can see now how the role, for example, of the US is actually kind of downsizing in that sense. We are increasingly moving in the direction of multi-order world and understanding how these orders are formed and what role they will play. And with that comes actually the role of smaller states. That, I think, what makes the world and the situation is very interesting, and that's why we need to embrace change, because it is no longer about Russia, it is no longer about China or the US or Europe for that matter. It is about order, different orders, how they come to work together, cooperate, or perhaps compete. And that would be my point of kind of departure. But of course, there is a challenge that comes with it. The document said that the only thing we know now is that we are dealing with a rather unpredictable world. Then obviously we need to understand that we cannot govern as we used to govern before. Things are changing. We need to speak about new agency. We need to speak about new structures and new strategy and vision. The EU is very good about putting structures and agency together, but is there a vision? And that's what I put on the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So a world beyond dwarfs and giants. Petr, your thoughts, please.
Thank you. Well, I think that us Europeans, we are quite rich, but we are weak. And that's something which is obvious. Bad news is that this is not sustainable. Good news that it is not inevitable. Why is it not sustainable? Because at a certain point, you need to be strong to protect your prosperity. I think that the world is perhaps more state-centric than it used to seem in the 1990s. In the 1990s, we had this period where we thought, there is a lot of transnational things, borders do not matter that much, state is getting weaker and weaker. that's not the experience of the last decade, of the last 20 years. We see actually big geopolitical beasts on the world stage. USA has always been a big beast. We see that Russia turned again into a big geopolitical beast which needs to be taken seriously. We see China, we see others. So we need a capacity at the European level, and really European level, which will be able to protect European interests in this environment, in this global multipolarity, global balance of power. When we talk about all these multinationals and the mobility of capital, it's true, but on the other hand, these multinationals are always linked with a specific great power. So when we talk about GAFA, if you are American president, you can talk to GAFA from the position of force. If you are a European leader, you cannot do it. You can talk to them nicely and try to convince them about something, but that's it. So in this respect, there is an objective need to develop European strategic power. That's why I think that's unsustainable to believe that we can keep our prosperity without actually being able to protect our prosperity. Then about why our current weakness can be overcome. Because I think there are two sources of our European weakness. One is the lack of military capacity, or lack of capabilities to project power, which is quite evident with respect, for example, to Syria, which is quite evident with respect to the Northern Africa and other territories where we think actually that we should be active, where we have almost consensus that it's the area where we have clear interests and we should take care of them, and we are not able to do this. So there is a lack of capacity, lack of military capacity. So that's the first weakness, and the second weakness is probably more fundamental, is sort of probably the cause of this, and that's the lack of political unity. And on this actually I'm quite optimistic. On this quite optimistic, because despite the growing number of member states of the EU, even though with Brexit we shouldn't speak just about the growing number, but the EU is actually much bigger than it used to be. We actually see that there is a significant convergence of geopolitical interpretation of the major political issues in the world. So we are able to have a European perspective on Ukraine, we are able to keep this perspective, and I think we are able to have a European perspective on Iran deal, on the fact that it was a good deal, which needs to be stuck to, which needs to be saved today. And there are other important areas where Europeans are actually today able to formulate a European view. And with enough will, they will be able to, or we will be able, to develop capability to make this view valid to others.
So, sort of political unity giving way to actual capabilities.
Political unity as a precondition, as you said, exactly. Yeah.
But I mean, I'd like to come to Josef about this, because one looks at a lot of the big policy issues that have come before Europe in foreign policy terms recently. You think of Syria, you think of Libya, you think of the refugee crisis insofar as that's a foreign policy issue. You look at a lot of what the Trump administration done. That's been a story, it seems to me, largely of fragmentation, of the struggle to pull together European alliances.
I mean, what is obvious? You will always start with 27, 28 national interpretations, and for some time, they will persist. But at certain point, you see convergence. I think right now, on migration crisis, we have this kind of convergence. There is a convergence that we need to be able to control our borders. That was not obvious. I mean, 4 years ago or 3 years ago, we now know. And with other crises, you could actually you could argue the same, you know. So I don't see actually major divergence or actually increase in divergences.
Do you see the Trump administration driving that convergence?
I mean, Trump is helping us. I mean, you know, there was a statement, and that's not my statement, but I love it, saying that we would not have European communities in the 1950s if we didn't have Stalin. And that was Paul-Henri Spaak who said that, one of the great founders of the European integration. unfortunately, it seems to me that us Europeans, we need to be forced by someone really to cooperate and to like each other more. So we should be grateful to Trump.
We should be grateful to Trump. Well, there we go. Josef, you were, I think, a little closer to my pessimistic sketch in your response, at least in my understanding of it. Would you like to come back to that sort of more, perhaps slightly more upbeat vision of European collaboration?
I should come back to a more upbeat, you would want me to comment from my pessimism. Yes. No. Well, I normally, as a think tanker, I'm structurally an optimist, because if you're a pessimist, you shouldn't be in the think tank community, because then all of the ideas that you generate won't go nowhere. So I still happen to believe that it is possible to change the world in a positive way, but I just see so many constraints. And with regard to what has been said before, some people may say, with Xi Jinping, with Putin, with Trump, and now with the proliferation of their attitude to international relations to the sort of the regional power level, Erdogan now has adopted this scheme for himself as well, and others will follow. This should be another one of those moments, like in the Stalin moment in the early 50s. I'm afraid it is not, because we Europeans, we have developed a deeply rooted political culture that is the culture of a trading state. And the trading state paradigm is that politics is an interference, is a diversion of the normal way of things. And so politics should please stay out of major commitments with costs unless there is no other way. And that's why we usually respond in a reactive way. That's why we have waited for years to have a massive refugee population building up in countries around Syria, telling ourselves that we do so much because we pay into UNHCR. Rather than to say, okay, we don't have the means to end this conflict militarily, but shouldn't we be there massively in order to help the people that are fleeing from this conflict, in order for them to have a fair perspective to stay and go back once the conflict is over? No, we didn't do this because we felt we weren't forced to. We only respond when it becomes unavoidable. Now with European security, yes, the Chancellor says we will take our destiny into our own hands. But the trading state logic is to say, but will it really become that bad? Should we not wait, another year? Maybe it's not getting that bad. So why spend 2% on defense when actually we're not going to war anytime soon? So this is so deeply embedded in us, and it has to do, of course, with the fact that we, even though we are so powerful on paper, we will never apply that power in reality. And that's why we are not the first ones to be called when there is a crisis. Now, so I'm not saying that this cannot change. I think there will be, and there are, crises in which this changes. You can see it in terms of the gradual awakening of European policymakers to the need to have an Africa policy. We have afforded to have that on the back burner. That was for the development community, and it wouldn't go anywhere anyway. But let them spend some money there, it doesn't harm. And now we see that it's a strategic challenge to which we need to respond in a much more thorough and sustainable way than we usually have thought about it. But that's the European pattern. Basically, we have to be confronted with the real costs of a real problem before we start considering to throw some money and energy at it.
Thank you. We've touched a bit on the question of, can Europe act with a common political will? What are the possibilities? What are the challenges? What about a common capacity? We've seen in the last few days alone discussions about this question of whether PESCO, so Structured Cooperation on Foreign Policy, can sit alongside a more vanguardist intervention force, the likes of which has been proposed by Emmanuel Macron. Elena, in your statement at the start, you said that we need to stop thinking in terms of these big blocks. Is it, first of all, desirable, and secondly, is it possible for Europe to act more, in terms of defense, but also in terms of diplomacy and soft power, at 27 or close to 27? Or is that something that we shouldn't even be pursuing?
Thank you. This is a very good question, but if I were to link it to the previous answer as well, because we tend to talk about this, the drivers that kind of impact on the change that we witness. We talk about Trump, we talk about, well, we haven't mentioned Brexit yet, we talk about other things. But the point is, they're just factors that actually push us in certain directions. But the causality actually is elsewhere. These are just the kind of the moments that push us forward. But what I'm trying to say is that the change is actually here, and the change is actually within our own space, and that's what we need to come to grips with. And I don't think this is happening yet, in the sense that the change is so important in a sense of what is coming, that yes, we do go back now to the level of the domestic, and that's when actually the domestic level challenged the existing international order, because international institutions and even the structures within the EU, they don't tend to respond adequately to what is happening on the ground. And therefore, I think it's a good thing, it's a positive thing that actually what we observe now in terms of populist movements, in terms of change at the domestic level, that this would actually help us, especially within the EU, to think collectively. That's where I think fragmentation, in a sense how we come to observe it, actually matters even more, because it would push us all together to think collectively, and that's when we come to rethink structures. And given my specialism, that I look more sort of into the neighborhood, especially towards the east and now wider afield into Central Asia. What is interesting that I think there is now a greater sense of realization as to what we need to do with the kind of the wider world, how we need to approach it collectively, rather than kind of from individual member states' perspectives. And that, I think, is a natural process. But we need to understand change. We need to understand that it is coming from within. We need to understand that domestic level is as important as it is the EU level. In fact, if anything, that it contributes very much to the EU level. And that what brings sustainability then, eventually, especially if we put on the table the concept of resilience, depending how we, of course, we're going to look at it.
Thank you very much. I'll come to questions next. I just wanted to very quickly ask Petr something, because I noticed you nodded when I mentioned PESCO. Seeing as we have you here as a representative of the Czech Republic in France, I think you're really well placed to comment on this question of at what level of breadth and inclusivity should European foreign policy proceed. I mean, the Czech Republic is seen as it's a member of the Visegrad Group, but it's also got particularly good relations with more countries to its west. Where do you stand on this question about the desirability of breadth, the likes of which it seems Angela Merkel is particularly concerned about, versus a sort of vanguardist depth to foreign policy cooperation, which is traditionally associated, and certainly in these days of the Macron presidency, is more associated with France?
Thank you for this question. Can I also react to this concept of trade in state, which
yes, please.
Introduced? Because I find it quite interesting, because I agree to some extent that there is a trade in state mentality in Europe, but I don't think it's pan-European. That's something which is typical for Germany. It's typical for Netherlands, for some smaller country in Northern Europe. But if you look at France, this is not the mentality which would be typical for France, you know. So of course there is a trade in state mentality there, but there is also, I would say, a more strategic political approach to the world. So which perhaps can be a reason for some optimism regarding the future of Europe as a strategic actor. As far as your question is concerned, I think today we have several important initiatives in the area of European defense. One of them is PESCO. Czechia is part of it. We offered several projects to PESCO, and we believe, actually, of course, you raise this question. There is a trade-off between inclusiveness, inclusivity, and effectivity. So apart from PESCO, there is another initiative which is called European Intervention Initiative, which is now actually in the French hands, which tries to avoid some things, which tries to avoid too heavy institutionalization, which is often linked with Brussels. So I think both of these directions are important, because if PESCO works with the current setup, which is actually inclusive, because I think almost everyone is in PESCO, then it's fine. If there are real problems in PESCO and we are again in the Brussels quagmire, where we have more than 20 people just talking and doing nothing, then there is this, then we have European intervention initiative, which may bring some tangible results. So at this point, I think we cannot afford to launch a new initiative which will be just on paper. So we need practical results.
Thanks very much. So I think we've unpacked a bit both this question of willingness to act together and ability to do so. But I see that questions are building up. My tablet, I'm afraid, is not working, so I'm going to have to come and read them straight off the screen. Right. Let's just start at the top. Dennis, I think I'm pronouncing that right. There's a wide-ranging consensus reaching from the Hungarian PM to the French president on the need to create a European army for defensive purposes. Do you agree? I wonder, Josef, could you start us off on that? Yes.
I don't see that agreement. No, I don't see an agreement to build a European army. I see agreement to work more closely together, but it is compartmentalized. It's a set of several agreements, none of which involves all of the member states, such as the European Intervention Initiative by Macron, which will be a French project run and led by France, with a couple of member states participating reliably. Now, the PESCO initiative is a very different animal, and not compatible really with the French Intervention Initiative, even though it would benefit from its existence. But when you ask around capitals whether actually every one of those now participating in PESCO is actually sharing the longer-term perspective that this PESCO initiative will equip the European Union with commonly funded and commonly owned militarily relevant assets, I would say some member states will say, well, this was not really what we signed up for. We signed up for something that would give us money to do military projects or development or streamline our organizations, but not about this military assets thing. But that's, I think, what PESCO is about in the long run. Now, and thirdly, there is the issue that in Central Europe is very much alive, which is territorial defense. Again, it's neither covered by the Macron initiative, nor covered by the PESCO initiative, and nor is it interesting to all of the member states. This is my criticism. I see that France is not the trading state that Germany is or the Netherlands is, but France is sort of a selective leader in this. France has no Ostpolitik. France has no interest in answering the question, how should Central Europe, including Germany, including the Baltics, all the way between the French eastern border and the border of non-EU, how should that space organize its territorial defense?
So a European army for what?
Well, it doesn't need to be a European army, but it needs to be an effective way of organizing the territorial security for these countries. That is not a concern of French European policy or French strategic thinking. It is a concern in this region, but we have no answer.
I might come to you, Elena, about that, just briefly to follow up on it. I mean, the idea of tighter European defense integration is very associated with the country where Petr's based, France. But how is that seen from countries in the east of the Union and further east still, when the meaning of defense and the defense priorities are so different from that sort of expeditionary French defense tradition?
Well, you see, this is one of the reasons that I've started with change. And of course, there comes the challenge. Because if we talk about kind of creating the need, in order to grapple with change, we talk about the need to create new agencies, but more importantly, new structures. Because a lot of the structures that we inherited from the past, that have been in existence, including even NATO. You know, now that we are working on this, on the idea of having permanent European army, that actually brings into the question then the need to have NATO, the relevance of NATO, but not just that. Looking at the East, what is increasingly questioned are the structures that are there, especially to mediate conflict and crisis in the East. OSCE is one of them, for example, and a lot of the countries bring now into question the idea, do we need to revisit Helsinki agreement? I don't know, you might have heard about this new idea that we need actually Helsinki too, given the fact that when it was signed and who actually signed it and what kind of new structures we need. And for example, Lukashenko, president of Belarus, is particularly vocal now, having created that kind of neutral space, or wanting it to be seen as neutral for negotiations, especially with everything that is going on in the neighborhood. He's really pushing forward with the idea of Helsinki too. China is not part of, is not signatory of Helsinki 1. So that's what I'm saying. Now that change is happening, we see increasingly that those existing structures, they're not perhaps adequate enough to cope with that change, that we need to be creative and visionary enough in order to see where we want to be, whether we need European army. If we do need European army, do we need NATO as well? And how then OSCE could then deal with everything else that is happening in the East.
Thank you very much. There's a question here I'd like to pass to Petr from, here it is, from an anonymous questioner. Macron and Merkel have proposed QMV in EU foreign policy and a European Security Council. I think that's a reference to the statement on Tuesday from the meeting in Germany. Would that strengthen or weaken the EU, and should the UK be included?
Well, I'm not sure that we are actually at this point. We are not at the point of including qualified majority vote into these matters. We should have, I think, we should really now pursue with the projects we have on the table to bring them to some practical results, and that at a certain point when we see that this convergence, which is real, which is between us, becomes actually even more intensive than we can think about QMV. Right now, if we did it, it would actually damage the European Union. It would be the same mistake as the mistake which was committed 3 years ago, when the migration question and the quota were actually imposed by qualified majority voting. So at a certain point, if you use QMV, you may create a European decision, but if this decision is not really legitimate, and there are some countries which are strongly against it, then it's damaging to European integration. So I would be actually very, very cautious about introducing QMV right now.
One suggestion has been that QMV be introduced in certain foreign policy decisions before others. I mean, do you see that as a way into it, or would you?
Then we have a technical debate. Then we have a technical debate about where, how, and I think it's definitely useful perhaps to start the debate and see the options. But again, I mean, on general level, I would be rather cautious.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions which I might turn to you, Elena, about perceptions. To go back to actually what we were just talking about a little bit, perceptions of the EU from the outside. I know you talk to a lot of policymakers beyond the EU's own borders. One questioner asks, are there any expectations of the outside world about the EU that could be harmful for the EU's ability to achieve its goals in foreign and defence policies? So perceptions that undermine the coherence or the effectiveness of common action. And I guess this could be a reference to Russia, China, or the world beyond?
Perceptions, of course, important, because perceptions, especially external perceptions of what the EU does and how it does, because it relates to one of the words on in the title of the panel, so it's capacities, credibility, and coherence. So it obviously directly speaks to credibility, how the EU positions itself as a global power, but also how it does it in order to ensure its legitimation by the outside world. And this is where, of course, I find the EU, on the one hand, as a collective body, very responsive. So it actually is fairly adaptive, given the pace of change, especially in relation to the neighborhood. But at the same time, while it is responsive and adaptive, it also tends to use and reduce itself to using kind of the same instruments, or think at least within the same box of how to approach the outside world. For example, a new concept of resilience has been thrown onto the table, which is a fantastic concept from, yet again, from an academic point of view, because resilience is all about capacity building. So you actually transfer, not so much transfer, you give power to the outside world in terms of defining their direction, in terms of building their capacity, in terms of actually becoming self-governable, sustainable, beautiful concept. But then again, when it comes to operationalizing it, we are stuck within the same problem. How does the EU see it? It tends to use the same instruments that are already in place. It tends to put in place the same monitoring and evaluation mechanisms in order to benchmark the development in the outside world against its own aims and objectives.
So it's too one size fits all.
Yeah, and of course there is a third dimension of local ownership, but local ownership is seen not as an ownership of the states who need to develop, rather than as an opportunity to legitimize the EU project, which is slightly wrong, and we need to move beyond that and give more opportunities to the outside world in terms of defining their needs and working with the EU. And that's where the EU needs to move a bit forward in terms of, yet again, ensuring its credibility and staying as a global and sustainable, to ensure sustainable development of the outside world.
A very short supplementary question, which I see is related to this. How does Brexit change the perception of the EU by the rest of the world? Has that undermined the EU's credibility in the eyes of external players?
It's a hard question to answer, especially that I take it very personally, living in the UK and experiencing everything, all that madness that is currently happening and unraveling, and all the consequences that we will have to deal with. Yes, on the one hand, of course, Brexit blew a huge hole, I think, in the image of the EU as a unified, credible, powerful actor. But at the same time, if we are to view everything that is happening now from a perspective of change, that we are moving into a multi-order world, yes, let it be. Let the UK deal with the consequences of becoming an island again in a global world, and let the EU move on and actually prove the point that actually what works now is precisely that collective unity that work together in terms of moving forward. And I think that is the perception that is now a lot of the neighbours, and not just the neighbours, but also countries in Central Asia, they tend to view it as it is.
Thank you very much. I'd like to throw one question to you, Josef, because I guess it touches a bit on a subject that's quite live in German politics at the moment, namely immigration. Thanks. The question is, Europeans are increasingly, the questioner says, Europeans are increasingly hating migrants, talking about hard power and framing trade as a security issue, i.e. in relations with China. Is Trump our destiny? So is unilateralism, a word that's been used an awful lot in Berlin in the last few days, is that the way we risk going?
Unilateralism and Trumpism, for that matter, could be in our cards if we don't act smart, if we don't respond. You know, I find it rather complicated to frame all of this issue of migration in the sort of the binary logic of you're either an open society or a closed society. You're either welcoming or you're fortressing. You know, I don't think that this is the point. I think we need to recognize that the readiness of otherwise intelligent, open-minded societies to deal with large-scale migration is limited. If we want to turn people away from policymakers, we should continue to believe this. We will not solve the socio-economic, the humanitarian, the governance problems of the world, and not even of the wider neighborhood of Europe through migration to Europe. That is not possible. No? And so I think we need to draw certain lines. migration to Europe is not a human right. Some people believe this, or actually many people believe this. And I can understand why they do this. But I'm just saying it will not work. It will produce the kind of results that we want to prevent. So Europe will have to have a common migration, asylum and refugee policy, and that policy will be restrictive. We have, in Germany in particular, we will have to reconsider the way that we look at our asylum laws, because it's a constitutional right and it is there for good reasons because of our terrible past. But we have to understand that we could only sustain this notion of a highly liberal asylum law because it is combined to the ability of asylum seekers to set foot on our territory. No, which then doesn't work out. So I think what I'm trying to get at is we need to understand that we will have to build such a controlled and restrictive policy, but at the same time we need to understand that this cannot be Europe's response alone. We have to reach out far beyond our own borders in a more sustained and a more active and a more committed way in order to deal with the issues that bring people to Europe, because we cannot solve these issues on European soil.
Let me just ask you a slightly broader sub-question, which I then might like to hear Petr's view on. More broadly, I mean, I think it came up, I forget who raised it, but the contrast between Europe today and the 1990s, this kind of very optimistic, very sort of multilateralist, very sort of end of history-ish period. Do you think that Europe, in thinking about all of these challenges, is becoming more sort of Hobbesian, more dog eat dog? Are we moving in the direction of a confrontational mindset on a lot of foreign policy issues? Do you think? Because I can understand how that's the impression people might have.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a matter of perspective, Jeremy. As you can think that Hobbes is dead as long as nobody else acts in a Hobbesian way. You know, as long as you're living in a comfort zone where multilateral order building is not contested, you can actually believe, okay, we have reached that stage, and from now on it's going to be this. Our problem is our multilateralism effective or not? You know? That was the principal problem of the 1990s. Now we are confronted not with the fact that nobody wants order anymore. Order is very much in demand, but we see other players, larger and smaller, that are taking a purely instrumental attitude to the regimes and structures and agreements that we have built. If it serves my interest, I adhere. When it runs against my interest, I step out. You know? And Europe is seen around the world by many, not by the Chinese, not by the Americans or Russians, but by many as the last defender of sort of a principled multilateralism, the actor most committed to building that order. But I'm afraid that this view or this perception overburdens Europe. I would say, you know, to feed your perception of me being a pessimist, I'd say Europe is probably well advised to try to prevent its own model of a multilateral order for the world to see, so then when this craze is over about sovereignism and national interest, that people can return to it and look at how actually a fair and balanced, rules-based and process-driven order could function.
So
I think
the last outpost of
it's just too big a task for us to be sort of carrying a global multilateral order commitment on our own shoulders if and when nobody else with assets is wanting to carry that burden with us.
Thank you very much. Petr, what's your response to that? I mean, were we living in a sort of benign Kantian bubble in the 1990s from which we're now waking up into a sort of horrible Hobbesian nightmare?
Well, I believe that the current world order has much more Hobbesian elements than it used to have. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that we should actually give up all our normative commitments. So I think, I agree actually with what Josef said, that sort of we should not be actually too ambitious or thinking that we can have on our shoulders the rest of the world. But I mean, there are two things in Europe. I mean, on the national level, European countries cannot really be unilateral. It wouldn't work. I mean, we have this European order. This European order is worth of preservation, is worth of development. So inside Europe, it's clear yes for multilateralism. Probably multilateralism which we have in Europe needs to be reformed somehow, because there are many things which do not really work. But the basic normative direction and orientation is okay. Now, at the global level, it's probably too easy to say, okay, we did it at the European level and now we will transfer it to the global level. Because that was, some people thought like that. Yeah. That will not work. But it does not mean to say we have our Kantian order inside, so but we can behave in the Hobbesian manner outside. I mean, like real beasts. So I think this sort of European cultivation should be with us. We take it from inside, and we tried to sort of to put it into what we do also outside.
Okay, I'm going to finish with a question that's got a lot of votes, so I think it's important to put it, and also because it brings us quite neatly back to where we began talking about political will and buy-in, and that's from talos.eu, who asks, how can EU member state citizens be better involved in foreign policy formulation? Should the European Commission's e-public consultation system be used? So I'd like you to respond to that, Petr, as a foreign policy practitioner here, someone who has to explain foreign policy, and then I'll come to Elena, who I think wanted to say something about the previous point, just for a very final quick word, and then we'll round up.
I'm actually quite skeptical about the involvement of citizens and public opinion, public in foreign policy making, both at the national level and at the European level. I don't think that European citizens should be involved in foreign policy making. No.
That's a very brave thing to say.
Yeah, because I mean, it's really specific, and there must be some basic legitimacy. So if people are really desperate, unhappy, they have in democratic system their possibility to say no to it. But I don't see the citizen involvement in foreign policy making, not on the European level, not on the national level.
Very, very, very clear and straightforward answer. Thank you. Elena.
Wow. Okay, I'll come back to the previous one. First of all, I think Hobbesian view of the world is perhaps most relevant now, when we are actually grappling with change, and of course we perhaps in some occasions we need the Leviathan to help us go through it, but I think Kantian view of the world is actually, that's what we need for the future, because in order to survive and simply become sustainable, we need to understand, we need to cooperate, cooperative orders, because the orders are coming, different orders, not just liberal international order. Look at the neighborhood, Central Asia. We have, at least the region at the moment is not so much torn apart, but at least it is on the interface of at least 3 different order building initiatives. Take the Eastern Partnership, take the Eurasian Economic Union, take the One Belt, One Road initiative. And the countries there actually are working with all 3 of them, and it is actually for the bigger players to come to understand it, that it is not black and white, and you do not force them to choose. You actually need to know, to learn to work with all 3 possible initiatives. Now, looking forward, citizens, democracy, I think it's fundamental. I'm really sorry. Citizens ought to be involved. They should not be driven to the brink of despair in order then to be heard. I think citizens define their governance, and that's what democracy is all about. We might have different values, different states might have different values, orders might have different values, but the point of democracy is all about democratic demos in governance, and that's, I believe, it has to be done through consultation. It works, actually, paradoxically, in the UK, despite the current state of affairs. There is a lot of public consultation, there is a lot of involvement, for example, in House of Lords initiatives, in terms of hearing and understanding the problem, then challenging the parliament, and then bringing the government to account. So I hope that also through marching citizens on the 23rd of June, government yet again will be forced to do something, or at least in the future, about Brexit consequences. So citizens matter, and I think that's the gist of the world we are in, at least in the EU.
Thank you. I'm just going to give a very, very quick final word to Josef, who wants us to add something to that. It's always nice when panelists don't agree on everything, so thank you.
I wanted to say that I admire the honesty that Petr brings to that question, but it is lost. It's a lost cause because we have so much public sentiment in foreign policy already. So much of our foreign policy is driven by what polls result and by what actors believe the people want to hear. And a lot of the foreign policy mistakes, particularly we make in EU affairs, has to do with the fact that we have a miscommunication with our own public. That I don't believe that, if to everything, e-consultation and e-government and so, to have citizens decide on everything will necessarily result in better politics. But I think one of the elements that we desperately need is a much better discourse, public discourse, involving citizens and parliaments and NGOs and government experience about the foreign policy challenges and the foreign policy agenda. Because there's too much emotion, there's too much polling, there's too much unreflected sentiment that is driving our foreign policy today.
So I think coming back somewhere in the middle between the two other speakers, how neat. Thank you all very much. Thank you to the audience for coming along and for the excellent questions. I'm sorry we didn't get through every single one of them, but I hope we managed to answer a good number fairly well. I'd like to thank the panelists, Josef Janning, I'm so sorry, Elena Korosteleva and Petr Drulák, and I think now we're going to a coffee break. So thank you very much.